So thanks very much everyone for joining me for this afternoon session. We're going to be talking about managing ConfigMgr internet clients with the Cloud Management Gateway. This is a really cool technology. I've deployed it for multiple satisfied customers and I hope you find the session useful. Note that the SharePoint conference is now the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. It'll be held March 23rd to 25th in the MGM Grand in Vegas. It sounds like a great trip. So shout out to the sponsors. The event wouldn't be possible without them. There's the sponsors. So my name is Gerry Hampson. I work for Ergo Group based in Dublin, Ireland. I've been doing this for a very long time. So first awarded Microsoft MVP in 2015. I'm hoping for my 6th award shortly in the next month or so. So I enjoy speaking at user group meetings in Europe and the US, and I've co-authored some books and published some training videos on ConfigMgr over the years. I have a blog where I publish information about technologies as I test them and issues that I've encountered. You'll see my Twitter handle there. Please follow me on Twitter as I often share tips and tricks. Now, I'll try and get to the Q&A at the end of the session, but if I don't get to answer your question, please ask me again on Twitter and I'll definitely answer it. Okay, so this is the raffle. Visit the vendor booth sessions, watch the videos, and then you need to submit your answers to enter the raffle. You need at least 5 correct answers for a chance to win, and I'll give you a moment to write down the URL for the raffle. I'm sure you've seen it a few times already. Okay, also 10% of funds from sponsors go to support community relief. Please consider donating to these great charity relief funds. We have United Way and International Medical Corps. And if you take a photo of the screen, it'd be a bit easier. Okay, so this is the agenda for this afternoon's session. First, I'm going to discuss the problems we're trying to solve. Obviously, every good solution starts with a problem that we have to solve. Next, I'll introduce the Cloud Management Gateway and explain what it does before going in then to more details on the components and how they will all work together. I'll list the prerequisites that must be in place before we can configure the CMG. Then we look at the CMG configuration and actually run through the process. And we're going to look at a CMG client experience using a Windows 10 client before then wrapping up with some troubleshooting tips. So let's crack on. So what are we actually talking about here? The challenge is to manage our clients, predominantly laptops, clearly. So once they leave the corporate environment, we've all seen this problem. A user gets a laptop and as IT department, we never see it again. They don't come to the office and they rarely connect to the VPN. So how do we actually manage those devices? And what do I actually mean by manage? So we want to be able to deploy apps to these devices, or at least make apps available to be installed. More importantly, we want to be able to patch these devices to maintain our security compliance. Now, I'm proposing using Microsoft Endpoint Manager, formerly Configuration Manager or Config Manager or SCCM or whatever you want to call it. And I'm proposing using that to manage these clients over the internet using the Cloud Management Gateway. Now, customers that are using the CMG have confirmed that the cost is pennies. It's literally pennies. So we're going to talk about that later. And because the CMG allows us to manage the clients over the internet, this allows us to keep management traffic away from VPNs. Now, that's obviously more important than ever in the COVID-19 era where organizations are struggling with bandwidth to offer services over saturated VPNs. So what is this Cloud Management Gateway all about? Now, the CMG allows us to manage our internet-facing clients without the need for a connection back to the corporate network. Now, that's nothing new, of course. We've had that for a long time. Previously, we could use internet-based client management or IBCM with Config Manager. Now, that was a good technology with many advantages. However, there were also some disadvantages. So the legacy IBCM, it required additional infrastructure investment. Now, that also created additional overhead and operational costs to support that infrastructure. And more importantly, the config manager infrastructure had to be exposed to the internet. Now we can use the Cloud Management Gateway to manage those internet clients. The CMG has been around since version 16.10, although there have been some very major enhancements in later versions. Now, in this session, I'll be referring to the latest features which were introduced in version 20.02. Now, the CMG itself, it consists of a Microsoft Azure cloud service and also a config manager site system role that communicates with that Azure service. Then internet clients can use the Azure service to communicate with config manager. So basically it's one or more Azure VMs and associated services, which are offered as a platform as a service offering from Microsoft. So you don't need to manage the VMs. Now it's really cool technology and it gives us many advantages over the traditional internet-based management. So for example, the CMG is easier to set up than the IBCM. No additional infrastructure is required for CMG. There's no requirement to expose the on-prem infrastructure to the internet. And Microsoft fully manage and maintain the Azure virtual machines that run the service. Now, there are a few points to note. You must have access to a paid Azure subscription, as the CMG will generate some cost. It is pennies per device per month, but there is some cost. Also, it's important to be aware that client management data will pass through the Microsoft Cloud. Just bear with me 1 second. And these are the typical CMG scenarios. So the first one is the most common scenario. We can manage our Active Directory joined Windows clients over the internet. Now, all clients that are supported by Config Manager are also supported by CMG, so Windows 7, Windows 8.1 and Windows 10 devices. These devices can be authenticated using PKI, or now with version 20.02, we can use token-based authentication, which is simpler again. We're going to be discussing the client authentication methods a little later. Secondly, we can manage Azure AD joined Windows 10 devices. Here we use Azure AD to authenticate rather than PKI. It's easier to set up and maintain this scenario, but it only supports Windows 10. Now, when I talk about Azure AD joined, I'm also including hybrid Azure AD joined. Finally, CMG allows us to install the Config Manager client on Windows 10 devices over the internet. This is in conjunction with Intune in the co-management scenario. So what can CMG manage for us without the need for a VPN? So we can do software updates and endpoint protection, inventory and client status, client settings, software distribution, and Windows 10 in-place upgrade task sequence, which is really cool. So basically we can manage many config manager features. They're supported over the CMG as long as they don't use a boot image, because that is not supported over the CMG. Just for clarity, these are some features that aren't supported. So you'll see some things there like client push and the config manager console not supported over CMG. Also Wake on LAN and peer cache, for example, are not supported. So what can the CMG deliver for an organization? Now you can deploy multiple CMG instances in a config manager hierarchy. Actually, Microsoft recommends creating at least 2 instances for high availability. Each instance supports up to 96,000 clients. Now this isn't a hard limit. These are simultaneous connections and performance starts to degrade if you go higher than that. And at this time, Cloud Management Gateway supports the management point and the software update point roles. But what a great start that is. This would allow you to keep all your internet clients fully patched, with an added bonus that in conjunction with a cloud distribution point, you can deploy software to these clients over the internet. And since version 18.06 of Config Manager, the CMG is actually co-located or configured with the as a cloud distribution point. So just a quick word about a cloud distribution point and what does that actually give us. So a cloud-based distribution point, it's simply a config manager distribution point, but it's hosted in Azure rather than on your own infrastructure. So again, it's a platform as a service offering. It's essentially an Azure storage account where you can store your content. Now that's an optional but very useful component in the CMG scenario. As I said, without it, you could deploy software updates to your internet clients, but not software. Now, there was a time where you could deploy a standalone Cloud DP, but now it's co-located with the CMG, and you won't be able to create a standalone cloud distribution point in the future. So what are the features of cloud-based DPs? So as I said, you can configure CMG to also be a cloud DP. They can support both intranet and internet-based clients. You can use cloud DP as a fallback content location. They can be added to distribution point groups, and ConfigMgr encrypts content before distributed to a cloud distribution point. But the main thing is you can manually scale the cloud service temporarily if you need, without installing additional distribution points and the additional infrastructure that's required on premise to do that. Now, there are some limitations to using Cloud DP, such as you can't enable a cloud-based distribution point for PXE for OSD. They don't support packages that run directly from the distribution point, so the client must actually be downloaded and then run locally. And they don't support pre-staged content or AppV, and they cannot be configured as pull distribution points. So how does the CMG actually work? Now let's have a look at a graphic showing the infrastructure and then the traffic flow. So this is our intranet. You can see there we have an on-premise Active Directory, which has got a domain controller there. You can also see it can include a certificate authority if you're using PKI to authenticate your clients. That comes a little later when we're going to talk about client authentication methods. Also, we then have a ConfigMgr primary site with the typical roles. So we have a management point, a distribution point, and a software update point. This is a current branch 2002 site. Then we have an additional site system role on the intranet. This is the Cloud Management Gateway connection point. We also have an Azure subscription. So here you can see we have a cloud distribution point and our CMG. They're now co-located as a single service, although the CMG is actually an Azure VM and the CDP is an Azure storage account. The Cloud Management Gateway connection point then gives us a reliable encrypted connection over the internet to the CMG. And ConfigMgr publishes then connection information and security settings to the CMG. And here we have our internet-based ConfigMgr clients. So as I said, the CMG supports all Windows clients that ConfigMgr supports. So what's the traffic flow? We're going to look at a scenario where I've deployed an application to an internet client. It's time for the client to receive its policy. It realizes that it's on the internet and it knows how to find the CMG service in Azure. So it forwards a request directly to Azure looking for policy using HTTPS or port 443. CMG then authenticates the client request using a token or Azure AD or PKI certificate or whatever you're using, and then it forwards it to the on-premise Cloud Management Gateway connection point. As I said, that's a persistent connection and you don't need to open any inbound firewall ports. The request is then forwarded to the correct role on the on-premise network according to URL mapping. So in this case, it's a policy request, so it's forwarded to the management point. The management point then confirms that the application has been deployed and is to be installed on the client. It sends details of the cloud distribution point so the client can then locate the required content. The client requests the content from the Cloud DP and the content is downloaded and the application is installed. Simple. Now, costs. So cost is an important factor to consider when we're planning a CMG deployment. Now, when you deploy CMG, charges are incurred on the Azure subscription account. So a standard A2 virtual machine is created automatically. The default is 1 VM, but you can select up to 16. Each virtual machine supports up to 6,000 clients, which is where the supported total of 96,000 comes from. Now, it's important to note that Azure VM costs vary by region, so Microsoft published an Azure pricing calculator to help determine potential cost. Now, you're not charged for data ingress or upload, so that will actually include distributing content from the site to the cloud distribution point. You are charged for data egress, which is the data flowing out of the service. Now, Microsoft estimate that to be approximately 100 to 300 meg per client every month for internet-based clients doing policy refreshes every hour, which is the default setting. Now, other actions like deploying applications will increase the amount of outbound data transfer from Azure. Internet clients managed with the CMG will get the software update content directly from Windows updates, so there's no charge for content storage. Then all other content like your applications, your corporate applications, they must be distributed to the Cloud DP and you must pay for that storage. Now, it can be tricky to estimate the cost. Azure environment may have other variables that affect the overall cost, but we do know from experience that the cost is literally pennies per client per month. And we're going to look at some CMG costs now. So my colleague Johan Aridmark has carried out some research into real world costs. He actually invited other community members to share their experience and the costs, and the results were quite staggering. And Johan published this information in a blog post. So for smaller organizations, Johan found that typically the CMG costs around $100 US dollars per month, no matter if you're managing 50 devices or 5,000. And then data is pretty cheap, so it doesn't really add much to the total cost for smaller environments. So you really see the economy of scale as the organization gets bigger. So let's have a look at some real world numbers. So we see that an organization with 300 devices costed that $100 that I mentioned. So that's then 33 cents per device per month. And if we look at some more numbers, 500 devices is more or less the same, and that's 21 cents per device per month. 700 gets a little cheaper at 14 cents. 2,200, still $100 US dollars. That obviously then reduces the price considerably to 5 cents per device per month, which is really nothing. Bit lower again on 3,500 devices, down to 4 cents. The same at 9,000, even though the cost now has risen to $350 US dollars a month. It's still 4 cents per user, per device per month. And staggeringly then, when you get to 100,000 devices, the cost is 3 cents per device per month, which is really nothing. It's literally pennies to manage your devices over the internet. I think it's a marvelous service. Now, this is my disclaimer. These are not official Microsoft numbers. As I said, these are real world numbers that are gathered and presented by the ConfigMgr community to help each other. Okay, so we're going to get into a demo shortly, but we want to talk about prerequisites. Now, the Cloud Management Gateway provides a very simple way to manage ConfigMgr clients over the internet. And although it is very simple to use, there are a lot of moving parts to the solution. So we're going to have a look at some of those prerequisites now. So the general requirements for the successful implementation of the CMG are as follows. So we obviously need client computers. They can be any supported Windows clients, and we're going to talk about the client authentication methods next. We need a ConfigMgr site. CMG was introduced in version 16.10. Version 18.06 has some great enhancements, but I'm using the latest version 20.02. We need a service connection point, which must be configured in online mode. And we also need a site system server running the Cloud Management Gateway connection point. You need an Azure subscription. You'll need a global admin account to configure the Azure services and at least a subscription administrator account to create the CMG. It is recommended to secure the CMG service in Azure with a public SSL certificate to gain native trust by the internet clients. So it'd be very useful to have a favorite SSL certificate provider. I use DigiCert for the simplicity of their process for generating CSRs, and then the ordering and verification is very straightforward. Also, you'll need to have an externally routable domain. We'll use this in conjunction with a cloud service name and the SSL certificate, and you must have access to the DNS records for that domain. So we're going to see that shortly also. Now, our resource provider is a service that provides supplies Azure resources. Some typical examples are the Microsoft Compute, which supplies the virtual machine resource. Microsoft Storage is another common one that provides the storage, obviously. Now, the CMG uses Classic Compute Resource Provider, which is not registered by default. Now, this is a very important point because we need to manually register it before we start. It's pretty straightforward. You can see on the screen there, really click on it, click register, it's easy. However, it's pretty straightforward if you have an Azure subscription which is provided via an enterprise agreement or a pay-as-you-go. The Classic Compute Resource Provider is not exposed when the subscription is provided by a cloud solutions partner or a CSP. Therefore, CSP subscriptions are not suitable for deploying CMG. Unfortunately, there is no way around that. Now, client authentication methods. There are some choices. So traditionally, we've used PKI to secure communications in ConfigMgr environments. The communication channel to the management point is secured by PKI certificates issued by your internal CA. Now, the easiest way to get the certificate on the device is to configure a GPO for auto enrollment, and the management point is then configured for HTTPS. Now, Microsoft still recommends using HTTPS for all ConfigMgr communication, but they recognize that it can be challenging for some customers due to the overhead of managing PKI certificates. Now, by using Azure AD integration and enhanced HTTP, we can simplify the process for managing Windows 10 devices. In this scenario, the Azure AD join devices can communicate with a management point configured for HTTP, and the site server then generates a custom certificate for the management point, allowing it to communicate via a secure channel. So hybrid AD join is straightforward to configure using Azure AD Connect. A service connection point is created in Active Directory, so clients can easily find information on what Azure AD tenant they should join. No further action should be required for Windows 10 devices because once hybrid AD join is enabled, devices will automatically join to Azure AD, and this has been happening since Windows 10 version 1607, which is out of support now. However, PKI, Azure AD join, it still didn't suit all organizations. Some organizations weren't ready for PKI or Azure AD, but they still need to manage Windows 7 devices. So Azure AD join was out. So ConfigMgr 2002 was generally released recently, a month ago perhaps, and it includes a real game changer. We can now use token-based authentication for communication between internet clients and the management point over HTTP. And the amazing thing here is we don't have to do anything additional on the management point or the client. All this works out of the box when you upgrade the ConfigMgr site to version 2002. Now remember, you must actually upgrade the clients to 2002 as well for this to work. We also have to authenticate the ConfigMgr site itself to Azure. Now, for this piece, it's recommended to use a public SSL certificate for the CMG service. Now, I want my service in Azure to be of the format Gerry H for my name, gerryhcmg.cloudapp.net, and that's what I have running on my lab. But unfortunately, I won't be able to get a certificate with that as a common name because clearly I don't own cloudapp.net, so DigiCert won't give me the certificate. Therefore, we have to be very clever. What we do is we use an externally routable domain that I own. I own emslab.ie, and I create a canonical name record or a CNAME record in our DNS records to create an alias for the cloud management gateway service to that friendly name. So you can see the kind of record that's required where I'm going to map gerryhcmg.emslab to .ie to gerryhcmg.cloudapp.net. So I'm then able to get a certificate with the name gerryhcmg.emslab.ie, and the CNAME record will divert the traffic to the cloudapp.net address. So it works really well. Talk about firewall ports. So what are the ports used by the CMG? In general, there's not too much required. We don't need any inbound ports for the on-premise network. Outbound, the CMG connection point does require some outbound ports. If you use, this is a bit weird, if you use a single VM instance, then you only need to open port 443. If you're using 2 or more VMs, you need to open ports. And if you use 2 VMs, they don't use 443 anymore. They use 101.24 and 101.25. And then up to 16 is supported. So in that case, the CMG connection point uses HTTPS 101.24 for the first VM instance, and then the second instance is 101.25 up to the 16th on 101.39. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at some of the prerequisites of this. So this is my Azure portal. So as I said, when we create a CMG in Azure, we're actually creating a custom cloud service, and that needs to be unique in Azure. So we have to see if we can find an available name before we continue. So in the Azure portal, if we go to create a resource, we just type in cloud service and go to create. Now in the URL field, we type the desired name. So I've already used Gerry HCMG in my lab, so this will not be available. And it's telling me that is not available. So let's say then I wanted to use Gerry CMG. And we can see that one is available. So the full service name would be gerrycmg.cloudapp.net. Now, you obviously pick a name that's suitable for you. Now you need to be careful with this. Don't use any special characters for this name, because the same name will create your CMG, but it will also be used to create your Azure storage account for the Cloud DP, and the Azure storage account does not support any special characters. Now, don't continue to create the service now. We just want to make sure that the name is actually available. And this is the externally routable domain that I own. You can see where I've created the CNAME record. As I say, I have Gerry HCMG working in my lab, and I can use gerryhcmg.emslab.ie as a common name for my SSL certificate, and then that will direct request to gerryhcmg.cloudapp.net. Back in the Azure portal, if we have a look at resource providers, this is one of the first jobs we always have to do, is to go into the resource providers for the subscription. And we see it's registered in my subscription, but simply if it wasn't, you click on it and register. It takes a couple of minutes for it to register. Okay, so back to the deck. So now that the prerequisites are actually in place, the configuration of the CMG itself is very straightforward. First, we configure Azure services for cloud management in the ConfigMgr console. So this creates the apps in Azure that ConfigMgr uses to authenticate. And it also integrates the Azure AD tenant into the ConfigMgr console. Then you'll add the CMG. So for this, you'll need the SSL certificate with a private key, and you'll need it in .pfx format. So the CMG wizard detects the name of the certificate and automatically changes the name for the CMG service to cloudup.net. We'll see that in a moment. Now, note that you can also use a wildcard certificate there. You then choose your Azure region for the service. I normally choose North Europe or its peer, which is West Europe. And then you can choose to create the resource group in advance or let the wizard create it for you. But whatever you do, make sure that you apply tags to the resource group afterwards so the customer can identify it later. Then you choose the number of VMs for the service. As I said before, you can choose between 1 and 16 VMs. And finally, you check the box to allow the CMG to function as a cloud distribution point. Then you have to add the CMG connection point. There's a site system role which enables this consistent and high performance connection from the on-premise network to the CMG service in Azure. And when you run through the wizard, the CMG and the region are already pre-populated because you've already added the CMG. Then you configure the management point to allow CMG traffic. It's just a checkbox. However, if you're not using HTTPS, the checkbox only becomes available when you enable enhanced HTTP. Optionally, you can configure the software update point to allow CMG traffic, and that one truly is just a checkbox. And then we need to verify the client settings. Now, the ones we're interested in are enable clients to use a cloud management gateway and allow access to a cloud distribution point. You'll find them in the cloud services section. So now let's have a look at that in action. Oh, got stuck there for a moment. So yeah, so this is my ConfigMgr console. So if we navigate to administration and then cloud services, we can see there's the cloud management gateway node. We're going to get back to that one. But the first thing we need to do is to configure the Azure services for cloud management. Now, I've already done that, but let's have a quick look at the properties. So the properties are there, and if we look at applications, so these are the ConfigMgr apps that have been created in Azure that allow the ConfigMgr to authenticate with the Azure service. And that also populates the Azure AD tenant node. And when we've done that, then we can add a CMG. Now you can see I've already created one that's working, status ready, using the name Gerry HCMG, but I'm going to use another certificate just to run through the wizard to show you an example. So if we go to create a CMG and launch the Create Cloud Management Gateway wizard. So we choose our Azure environment as Azure Public Cloud. The other choice is US Government Cloud, but I don't think they're going to let me use that. And then we go to sign in. Okay, and when I sign in, the details are pre-populated, the tenant name, the app that's pre-created with the when I configured Azure services. I need to make sure to select the correct subscription and then continue. Okay, so as I said then that we're going to browse to our SSL certificate. So it's of the format .pfx. This is the one I've used for my production demo, but I'm going to use this one for now. It's protected by password and it has a private key. And you'll see that the service name is detected from the certificate as ghcmg.emslab.ie. And then the deployment is automatically created as ghcmg.cloudup.net. So you would have a CNAME record to direct the traffic from this to this. Then we choose our region, as I'll choose West Europe for this. We can then choose to use an existing or to create a new resource group. And then if you look at the VM, so currently the default is 1, But look, when I try to choose and if we used 1, we'd need an outbound connection on port 443. See what happens when I try to use 2. It tells me that we're now need you to open 2 ports for outbound connections starting from 101.24. The same with 3, need to go from 101.24. Well, we're going to just choose 1 for now. I'm going to uncheck this because I'm not going to publish my certificate revocation list externally. And you need to make sure to check the box to allow the CMG to function as a cloud distribution point and serve the content from the Azure storage. So that's pretty much it. Then you'd specify thresholds for outbound data transfer here, but I'll accept the default settings. And then you would finish this to create the CMG. Now, when you do it, it takes about 20 minutes to deploy, and you can track progress in the Cloud Manager log file. Next, then, we would add the CMG connection point. So that's just a site system role. So if we choose our primary site server and we add a site system role, I've already done it. You can see it there. So it won't allow me to create another one, but I'll show you as far as we get. It would be listed here. So we choose it and we go and we finish to add the thing. And the CMG name and the region, as I say, will be pre-populated as you've already configured the CMG. Okay, so then we need to configure the management point to allow CMG traffic. But first, we need to enable enhanced HTTP. So that is in the properties of the site. And if we look at communication security, we check the box to use Configuration Manager generated certificates for HTTP site systems. Then I can go into the management point and I can allow Config Manager Cloud Management Gateway traffic to use the management point on HTTP. Okay, so the connection analyzer, the CMG connection analyzer, is very cool. It shows us all the moving parts that we've configured are working together successfully. So if we're going to highlight the connection, the CMG, and click Connection Analyzer, all we do is sign in and click Start. And we're looking for all green here, and that's what we have. So it shows that all the working parts are successfully working together. Now, if it's not working, this analyzer gives some very useful status messages for troubleshooting. And finally, then we're going to look at client settings. If we look at the client settings, we're looking for cloud services. Cloud services, and we're interested in allow access to the cloud distribution point and enable clients to use the cloud management gateway. This particularly is the one that we're interested in. Okay, so back to the deck. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is actually managing the clients with the CMG. Now, after the CMG and the connection point are completely configured and running, the intranet clients will get the location of the CMG service automatically on the next location request, and that's every 24 hours by default. If you don't want to wait that long, you can force the request by restarting the SMS agent host service. Now, for 2002, when you upgrade the client and the site to version 2002, the client then automatically receives a self-prove token from the management point. The 2002 client doesn't need PKI certificate or doesn't need to be Azure AD joined in order to communicate securely with the management point. Now, after the client then knows the location of the CMG service, it figures out whether it's on the intranet or the internet. And if the client can contact the domain controller, it will use the on-premises management point for communication with Config Manager. But if it considers it's on the internet, it will use the CMG. Then the client with a 2002 client, the client pairs its self-signed certificate with the management point issued self-prove token to communicate then with the CMG. So we're actually going to have a look now and see what that looks like on a Windows 10 client. So this is a Windows 10 client. This is the ConfigMgr applet in Control Panel. So you can see that the client is authenticating with the management point using a self-signed certificate rather than PKI. So if it was PKI, we'd actually see that written here as a PKI certificate. You can also see that this is a 2002 client because that's the version number for 2002. So it will be using token-based authentication. We'll also see that this device is not Azure AD joined. And you can see with this PowerShell command that the device knows about the presence of the management point here. It's aware of the CMG as a management point. That is the external address. Okay, so back in the ConfigMgr console, we can see this was client 2. So we can see that ConfigMgr knows that this device is online from the internet. That is true. It also knows that the device management point is the online CMG as opposed to the on-premise. So the device is actually online, so we'll be able to manage this device over the internet. Actually, the one thing I didn't show is what we can see on here on the ConfigMgr applet is we can see that the connection type, so it knows that it's an internet client. So it knows there's actually not intranet. Okay, so because that device is now internet, we're going to manage it. There's several things we can do to for this cool. So we can, if we can do client notification, we can collect a hardware inventory. So we can force a hardware inventory in that client. We're told it's not online. Yeah, that is a nuisance. The demo gods are not with me. Let's do it anyway. And also client notification, you could restart, for example. Okay, so when we go to the client, I'm actually going to show the software center. So we open the software center. I've deployed an application 7-zip to this device. So let's go to install that. Yep. Okay, so let's install that. You need to uninstall it first. Okay, so I'm going to delete. I did this earlier, so now I'm just going to delete the file from the cache and do it again. Okay, so when I go to install the application, and this will install, and if we look at the cas.log file, we can see that the content was downloaded from the cloud distribution point. So it's pretty cool that we're going to be able to manage this device now over the internet. Okay, let's go back to the deck. So we're on to the last section then, which is troubleshooting. So what can you do if the clients aren't being managed properly by the CMG? So where do you start looking? Now, I like to break this down into the component parts to make sure that each one is actually in place. So the first one is the CMG communication with Azure. Is that still working? You check your Azure activity logs, check the Cloud Manager log file in ConfigMgr. Has the SSL certificate been configured with the correct name, and has the certificate expired? The CNAME record I showed you, is that in place? Check the DNS records. Maybe somebody deleted the record, that happens. Has someone forgotten to renew the domain? Then on in ConfigMgr, is the service connection point in online mode, and is it connected? Is there a problem there? Have you configured the management point and the software update point to allow CMG traffic? Then verify the client settings to enable CMG and also to allow clients to access the cloud distribution point. And how are your clients secured? Are they PKI, Azure AD, or token? And have you verified this on a client? Can you manage a client without the CMG? Because if you can't, then you won't be able to do it with the CMG. Run the CMG connection analyzer. It's really good tool. It'll check all these items and it'll give you an indication of what is actually happening. And then check the date and time on ConfigMgr site systems. It has to be really accurate. So I've seen situations where the time was wrong on the site system server by less than a minute, and this prevented the successful configuration of the CMG. Okay, so that's it. So we'll see if there's any questions now. Chris, is there any questions?
I do not see any in the queue yet.
Okay, that's great. So, right, so it's really important for the organizers and the speakers that you give feedback. So if you like the sessions, please say so. It will allow us to improve for future events. You can use the QR code there with your phone, or use the URL shown there. I'll pause here on that for a second. Okay, so that's the end of the session on the CMG. I really enjoyed presenting it, and thanks very much for attending today, and thanks very much for the team for inviting me. So enjoy the rest of the event, and bye for now.